Hello everyone, and welcome to the CBI's daily coronavirus webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today, actually, we're going to try and look beyond the day-to-day handling of the coronavirus and at a subject that, if you like, has been held in abeyance for the last few months, which is the Brexit negotiations, and now the intersection between what happens in the discussions between the UK and the EU and how that intersects with the restart and the recovery. We've got really a pretty muscular team to discuss it. So in addition to Josh Hardy, who's the Deputy Director General of the CBI, Nicole Sykes, who's running the unit that's looking at the EU UK negotiations for the CBI, and Sean Maguire, who's representing and runs the CBI's office in Brussels, is here. And I'm also really grateful, Anand Menon, thank you, the Director of UK in a Changing Europe, changing UK and a changing Europe these days. There's plenty to discuss, Alan, so thank you for joining us. As you know, I think many people have been on these calls pretty much in and out every day for the last few months. The value of it is feeding in what you're hearing, what you're experiencing into the CBI, as well as, of course, hearing what the CBI is learning in its conversations with government. Please do weigh in. We've talked so much in the last few weeks about access to finance, furloughing, PPE, test and trace, and that's all really helpful. We haven't had an opportunity like this in the last few weeks to think about the granular issues in terms of the trade negotiations and either ask a question, I'll feed it in, or actually, if you want to make a point, do that too. I know that the CBI team is really keen to hear what is on the top of people's minds. Please do it, and if you want to do it anonymously, of course, you can do that too. Just do that in the chat. Josh, can I start with you, though? It's often useful, actually, at the start here, just to talk a little bit about what's the sort of latest, particularly recovery, job retention, access to finance. Do you want to just give us a quick trip round the bay before we get started?
Yeah, I will, absolutely. But it had to happen eventually, didn't it? We had to have a Brexit negotiations webinar. It feels slightly like a sort of a relative who overstayed their welcome has turned up on the doorstep again. I guess this time the house is flooded.
What they've been upstairs all this time, suddenly come down. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, mate. Yeah. And Nicole, Sean, thanks so much. It'll be a great discussion. But I know that for so many of you, so many businesses, the focus is still absolutely relentlessly on the day-to-day survival and issues around coronavirus. So I will update on some of those developments. I think the first thing is we did have news from Alex Sharma last night that the 5 tests have been met for the reopening of non-essential retail, so that can proceed on Monday. Of course, totally not straightforward for so many firms because of the need to do risk assessments and share them with colleagues, customer communications, hygiene, handling of goods. So it won't be, don't expect every shop door to open on Monday by any means, but that will be beginning, and that is for many good news. In other areas, 4th of July earliest, something that matters deeply to so many people, the possible beginning of reopenings of pubs, of hairdressers, not something that I have worried about too much, of cinemas, of theatres. So obviously many a slip between cup and lip. 4th of July is some time away, but things starting to move in that direction as well. But for a lot of businesses that we're talking to, I think the really pressing thing today is furlough. Closes to new entrants on the 30th of June. Now that means, because of the 3-week qualifying period, today is the last day for many. So please do use our hub. Plenty of information there, routes through to the government resources. And of course, also a focus on the finance schemes. Won't go into detail there, but new figures out yesterday, 35 billion total. For bounce back loans, it's about 24 billion. And it's actually still around just over an 80% approval rate. So they seem to still be working. For civils, bit under 10 billion, about 50% approval rate. For those CL bills, bit under 1.5 billion, and the approval rate there a bit lower at 39%. So we will keep focusing on that. But I think listening to the media, talking to government, it's clear that the noise right now, and it is growing day by day, and the debate within government is on that continued challenge between what's positioned, but it shouldn't be positioned as a trade-off between the economy and health. The real question is how you get the two operating in tandem. And it does feel like three issues at the moment are really front of mind there. One is, of course, we heard a lot about it yesterday, school reopenings. You know, is that going to, how can that proceed in the smoothest possible way? Clearly not as the government had hoped, that every primary school pupil will be back in before summer, but it is vital to think about that. Of course, primarily the educational inequality that can be opened up and exacerbated by school closures. But for businesses, the childcare issues are absolutely huge, and how that can actually support a more inclusive approach to getting back to work. Second issue, quarantine, still very, very live. We've debated the issues before, so I won't do that, but that ministerial task force is being set up, roundtables are being held. Got an email about it from Bays this morning, reassuring us that on those issues like air bridges, like extending exemptions, there really are discussions going on. And I think the final one, we were talking about it just before the before this webinar began, that is really getting sharper, is that debate about 2 meters versus 1 meter in terms of social distancing. Differences around the world, WHO, other countries sympathetic to the 1 meter rule, would unquestionably make a huge difference economically for many businesses. But also you cannot deny that it has health implications. So another really clear example of that tension that needs to be worked through. None of this is easy, but I think as businesses at the CBI, the evidence that we can give to government actually genuinely helps them to make better decisions. So we will continue with that. So clearly that's been the focus for so many firms, absolutely rightly. But Brexit, that relative in the attic, coming down the stairs, hasn't gone away. I won't say much because I'll leave it to the experts, but I think in some ways it is proceeding.
Josh, before we go to Brexit, can I just pick up, I don't know whether we're having trouble with my sound, but I hope you can hear me. Just two things on the subjects you touched on. One is the bounce back loans and the C-bills, just on the access to finance point. How much are you concerned that the success, if you like, of the bounce back loans, which I know the CBI championed, is disguising the difficulties that businesses are getting for longer term finance to restart and essentially operate with COVID? How much is that a concern, and how much do you think the Treasury and Bays are beginning to think about that problem?
I think it is on the radar. I think there are a number of concerns, and this isn't to be critical. I think this is a very, very difficult situation with bounce back loans. I think one of the main concerns is actually when smaller businesses in particular need to repay those, whether there's a 13-month cliff edge for that. So there's a concern there. There's a concern that some are using them because they cannot access some of the larger loans as sort of bridging loans in a sense, and that's why we're working particularly on CL bills to see how we can smooth that. And then of course there's the third concern, which is as people come off furlough, as those funds are withdrawn, particularly those businesses that cannot open at the moment, that they're having to access more loans, more debt in order to support that. Again, looking at other mechanisms. At the moment, there isn't huge clarity on what other support tools might be available, but that is an active conversation with Treasury. It's something we need to take very seriously, because this is going to play out, as we've said many times, very differently for different businesses within sectors.
Okay, and just one other thing, forgive me, I think lots of people will be actually really appreciative of this focus on schools, on quarantine, on the 2 to 1 meter debate. But the one thing I'm really confused about too is test and trace, and what seems to be happening in practice on that. What's your read on how that's being rolled out and actually the effect it's having on business?
I think we have to be a little bit patient, if I'm honest, because yes, we are getting stories. We are getting stories about impact on individual businesses, about number of staff that in particular circumstances can be withdrawn from the workforce. Not making a judgment on whether that's correct in individual cases or not. But at the moment, there isn't enough evidence to really tell. I think the issues we're focusing on is the provision of statutory sick pay actually a deterrent in some cases to people following the track and trace advice? Because the most important thing is that system gets up working properly. Is the advice to businesses on what they actually do and circumstances when there are infections and their liability, is that absolutely clear? That's coming through. All the way through this crisis, the government has, to their credit, been clear that they're not going to get things right first time. It was true of the initial guidance for how businesses operate during lockdown. It was true of the business guidance coming out of lockdown. And I think it's true of track and trace as well. I think we've got to get it right. It won't be right at the very beginning, but they are listening to feedback, and they are working on that. So we're not rattling cages yet, but we are gathering evidence and looking at how it's working on the ground.
Okay, thanks, Josh. All right, so you were about to tee up the conversation about Brexit when I interrupted you.
Yeah, just a few thoughts from me. I think we never expected a fully fleshed out deal by June, or at least I don't think many of us did. There were sort of relatively low expectations, and I suppose in some ways the negotiations have delivered on those expectations, because there certainly isn't a deal on the table right now. But I don't say that flippantly, actually. I think it's important, because there's a risk that June becomes the be all and the end all, and that talk of sort of walking away happens. Actually, I think we need to make sure that nobody gives up. Yes, there is a sort of essentially a quite fundamental deadlock at the moment. The UK feeling that the promise of a Canada type deal was on the table, the EU being very clear that that comes with level playing field commitments that we're not willing to accept. We are at loggerheads. All the conversations that we've had with Tim Barrow, with Barnier, have shown that, you know, this isn't just negotiating noise. There are genuine differences of opinion, but that mustn't lead to people giving up, because businesses, as we've been very clear, are in absolutely no state to prepare for a chaotic exit right now, and particularly no deal. The economic disruption would be laid on top of what we're already feeling from the virus, and we cannot afford that. But at the same time, the UK government has ruled out an extension to transition, and there feels little point in pushing on that right now. So the only option is a deal, and put bluntly, it's their job to get a deal. So we will be relentless in pushing for that. We've had documents out. I won't go into detail of them, but the UK proposals, ambitious in some areas, patchy in others. But it does feel, from the conversations that we've had, that negotiating by Zoom is not terribly effective. That the negotiators themselves actually are struggling to break the deadlock. And our main call, therefore, is political leadership. Can the political leaders step in, show that determination, that creativity that they have shown in dealing with the virus, and apply that to the negotiations, use that to drive that breakthrough, and do that in July and August, because here the business timetable for planning and adaptation does not necessarily match the political timetable, where you may want to leave it until the last minute. But it's coming up, it's really serious now, and I'm really pleased that we've got such a great panel to talk about it.
Josh, thank you. And as evidence of that, there's just a slew of people coming with really specific questions and points of view. So I'm going to try and bring those in. But Nicole Sykes, Nicole, would you start for those people on the call, i.e. me, who feels that they've lost sight of this? What are the substantial points of difference that need to be resolved? And what's the timeline for 2020, given where we are now?
Yeah, so we've had about 4.5 rounds of negotiation. There was sort of a mini one back close to the start of the year. And time again, you're coming up against the same issues of the level playing field, where in a number of areas the EU is saying on the environment, on workers' rights, we would like the UK to commit to not lower their rules and their standards below where the EU standards are today at the end of transition. And on state aid, we would like the UK to remain in lockstep with our rules through the future. That is something which the UK is saying, absolutely not. We do not want to continue applying EU rules down the road. We want something that's much more standard. You've never asked sort of a free trade agreement style relationship with a country to have these commitments before. We're not up for this. One of the other big issues is fishing. Fishing is quite a small industry in the UK, but actually it's of outsized importance to a number of EU member states, and every free trade agreement that the EU does, it's a very emotive issue, and people feel very strongly about it. And there's conflict over how fishing waters should be apportioned. Those are two of the kind of biggest issues, the sort of gateway issues they're called by negotiators, that need to be passed through before we start getting into some of the more technical stuff. Now, that's not to say that those technical negotiations aren't happening. People are meeting and they're discussing things like qualifications for professional services, they're talking about technical standards for dishwashers and oven gloves and all sorts of things. But none of these areas of more kind of detailed and technical things, which are actually really important for business, none of them are going to get signed off, none of them are going to get completed until these kind of gateway issues have been passed through.
And then, Nicole, just to be clear, and actually I'm going to put the same point to Sean, timeline, is your expectation, as Josh said, that the 30th of June will come and go and that the UK government will not ask for an extension?
Yes. So there are actually a number of deadlines for the end of June. It wasn't just the transition one. The UK were both meant to kind of come up with what they wanted on fishing and also what they wanted on financial services as well. Our current expectation is that there won't be much progress on those. I think what will be key is there is talk, I don't think it's in the diary just yet, but about sort of a high-level summit. So not exactly like the councils that we used to have, because obviously the UK is not part of the European Council anymore, but outside of that, sort of political leaders getting together. Because I think what we saw in the previous rounds is you do need that political pressure to push. Negotiators are civil servants, they've been given their instructions and they're going out and trying to deliver on them. But until there is sort of a conversation at the political level about where compromises can happen, you're not going to be able to kind of relieve some of that pressure from that kind of pressure cooker and move on. So June is important, but I think that kind of what comes out of that high-level summit is particularly important. But really, some of the key things that I think civil servants are looking for from those from that meeting isn't necessarily particular policy positions. It's, will you still allow us to negotiate? There are no negotiations booked in, there are no dates set until you've had that meeting. And they actually want sort of a, can there be an intensification of these talks? They're taking place sort of every 3 weeks or so, 4 or 5 days of talks. Can we make sure that happens over the summer, that we don't close down, bring them closer together and be able to make more progress? Because right now, actually, the diary is empty.
Right. Sean, will you give us the interpretation of it from Brussels?
Well, thank you. I suppose Brexit has been down the list of priorities for EU leaders as well, given that all attention has been given to the current crisis and pandemic. And it really is only David Frost and Barnier who are meeting and discussing this issue. EU leaders are very much preoccupied by the recovery plan, the 750 billion euro, the multi-annual financial framework. I mean, these are bigger political issues for many EU leaders than Brexit. And unfortunately, Brexit is that poor relation at the moment where it isn't being brought up to the high political level. I think when you listen to press conferences, either from the UK or the EU side, there is an element of finger pointing, and one side blaming the other that they are misinterpreting what the have offered and what is expected. Very much agree with Nicole. There needs to be a high-level meeting in June after the European Council next week and before the 30th of June. It's in there that there has to be a stock-taking exercise, and only until that high-level meeting takes place and there's some leadership from both sides and indeed signs of compromise, I think we are stuck. The EU side have not responded to the UK demand of accelerating or intensifying the negotiations over the summer. UK would like to do that because they feel leaving it to September is too late. And indeed, for Chancellor Merkel, who will take over the presidency of the EU on the 1st of July, her big priority is to agree a budget for the EU going forward and indeed the recovery package of 750 billion to get Europe back out of its current crisis. Those will be the priorities in the first few weeks of the German presidency. So the more that can be done in a June high-level meeting to get the negotiators back around the table, to have some form of text ready for September that allows even further acceleration in the last 2 months up until October, November, is very much what European business is calling for.
Sean, thank you. Anand, can I just ask you to pick up on two things? I mean, you may have a broader point that you want to make, but two things in particular. You can't help feeling, to Josh's point at the top, that there are two completely different timetables. There's business, which is, can we have a deal done early so we can prepare, and politics, which is, let's run down the clock and try and do things at the last minute. And which one of those will win out? And just to Sean's point, that the priorities within the EU, particularly for Merkel and around the EU budget, relegate the issue of Brexit and how those two interplay together. Will you give your read on both of those things?
Well, on the first one, I think politics quite simply has won. I mean, I was surprised to hear David Frost say, we need to get this done quickly by the end of September so businesses have time to prepare. That struck me as several months too late for that, to be honest. What businesses know is that they're going to have to change, in most cases, their ways of trading with the European Union, because deal or no deal, that relationship is going to change quite fundamentally, given the kind of deal that the government is after. But nevertheless, we still don't know whether or not there are going to be tariffs. We still don't know many of the details. We still don't know. And remember, the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol hinges on the kind of deal we get with the European Union. I mean, that will determine how intrusive the checks are on that border. There is so much uncertainty that it seems to me that this is purely political. And, you know, whilst David Frost might talk about giving businesses sufficient time, it strikes me that 30th of September is far from sufficient time, even if that deadline is met. And I think Sean's absolutely right. I mean, in a sense, you know, Brexit has just fallen off the list of issues that EU leaders, national leaders in the member states are thinking about. And I think you need two high-level meetings, actually, to kickstart this process, neither of which are in the offing, I don't think. You need the European Council to start figuring out whether it can come up with a new mandate, because I think with the current mandate that the EU have, it's going to be very, very difficult to make any progress at all. There needs to be movement on both sides, but that requires the European Council to give some time to talking about Brexit at one of its meetings. I see no prospect of that at the June meeting, because as Sean says, they've got 750 billion euros to talk about. They're not going to talk about us. They've got quite enough to fight about without that. The other meeting that needs to take place is a series of meetings between our government and principals from the other member states. It's all very well saying that Boris Johnson is going to go to Brussels, or maybe not go to Brussels. It'll be interesting to see if he quarantines himself if he does go to Brussels on his return. But he needs to do more than meet with Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel. He needs to be talking to the member states, because at the moment the fundamental problem is that the European Commission is pretty determined to get a deal, but it's fighting on two fronts. It's fighting with us and what it sees as us, our rigidity on the issues that Nicole was talking about. It's also fighting with the member states who, whenever the European Commission tries to get a mandate that looks negotiable, say, actually, we need to tighten this. So coronavirus has massively reduced the bandwidth for this. But I think unless we get real involvement of the political principles, it's hard to see how anything can move.
And what about the infighting within the UK cabinet as well? There still is, it seems to me, quite a strong faction in the cabinet that is quite comfortable with no deal, and I'm unclear whether or not you think the dynamics of that have changed, and whether there's a real possibility of a no deal outcome at the end of the year.
I mean, I think a no trade deal outcome is more likely than it's ever been. Partly because of time, partly because of coronavirus. We're pinning all our hopes on the autumn. We have a second spike in the autumn and everyone's preoccupied with the pandemic again. Then when do we negotiate? So yeah, I think a no deal outcome is perfectly conceivable. I'm not sure about infighting within the cabinet. I think, to be honest, Boris Johnson is safe on Brexit, in the sense that all Conservative MPs have taken the pledge on this. even the Brexit ultras can live with the kind of deal he seems to be after, albeit that some of them would prefer no deal. There's a curious linkage in one way, I would say, which is that the same people that are pressing for the hardest of hard Brexits are also the same people who are getting increasingly frustrated with lockdown. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is no prospect of a request for an extension, because I think the thinking in number 10 is we can give these people a bit of red meat over extension, which might make them a little bit more patient with us when it comes to delaying maybe pubs opening or whatever else. So the two issues in a curious way have met over that. But I think, you know, whatever Boris Johnson ends up with, his party will stay behind him. I don't foresee, this is a brave thing to say, between now and the end of the year, a massive rebellion by people saying, actually, we'd rather have no deal. Though the language, I mean, I noticed there was a quote today on Sky by an anonymous minister saying, you know, no deal Brexit used to be a big deal, now it's virtually irrelevant. This thinking that because we've got the pandemic, a no deal Brexit really doesn't matter. I think that thinking is profoundly wrong, I have to say, but it seems to be becoming more widespread in government.
Nicole, can I just ask you about that? Actually, one person asked right at the start of the conversation whether or not, where the CBI is on that, where the CBI is on WTO terms and the need for a deal. Can you just set out what the CBI would like to see be the outcome of these negotiations?
Yeah, I can say that very clearly. We would be a big fan of a deal. That is definitely what we are pushing for. I feel like I've been pushing that for the last 4.5 years of my life. That is what we want. And I think actually coronavirus really does throw into sharp relief.
Sorry, was I slightly misrepresented the person who asked the question, which was to say we are overestimating the value of a deal and we're underestimating the flexibility and potential that WTO terms give to us, and we are mistaken in our thinking that the EU is going to hold out for a deal that is beneficial to us. So we should move on and prepare for those terms rather than continue to pursue this deal. That's the tenor of that question.
Understood. And look, I think we know that the deal that we are now heading towards is a lighter touch deal than perhaps we would have wanted. We know that it's pretty good on tariffs, although that is now under question. We know that it is pretty good in a couple of areas like some services elements around mobility, around qualifications, around data flows. But actually, you know, we do know that businesses will be facing some pretty significant barriers coming out of this because of the type of trade deal that we're going out to negotiate. But it is better than no deal, and that has come back pretty comprehensively from the business community. I mean, you only saw Nissan last week saying how serious a no deal would be. And if you do look at those areas where the deal looks like it could be pretty good, I mean, tariffs are just such a basic, but they are so important. If you're talking about pushing up the costs of our food by 22% when it comes to our exports on average, when it comes to food, you know, some of the things like milk and beef, our exports are astonishingly would place astonishingly high tariffs. And then there's the import side, which is a little bit more complex because the UK sort of has its own global tariff that's still kind of being worked out as far as I can tell. If you look at those and how significant the costs would be for business, of course you want a deal over that. And you know, some of the fundamentals have not changed. This is 50% of our trade that we do with the EU, just under. That matters, and we need to be able to preserve as much of it as we can, because particularly coming out of this crisis, we're going to be clawing back every decimal point of growth that we can find. It's going to matter, and it's going to matter directly to how many jobs that we can create coming out of this process, because millions will be lost. And that's ultimately what we're facing. We need to do everything in our power to make sure we can grow. And businesses absolutely say to me, the vast majority of them, that means a deal with the EU and as good a deal as we can get.
So Nicole, on that, yeah, and Andy, you wanted to say?
Well, just a couple of things on, just to follow up with what Nicole said. One of the ironies of this debate is what the EU are saying is if you're going to talk about tariffs, this will take longer. You know, because tariffs will involve us going back to the member states, figuring out where their interests lie, doing some impact assessments, and it makes it harder to finish than, you know, the thinner the deal is, the harder it is to finish before the end of the year, which is something worth taking into account. And yes, WTO terms gives us greater flexibility, but what concerns me more than the economics about WTO terms, I think, is the politics. My fear about the talks breaking down is that it just undermines political trust and political relations between us and the 27. And that matters in terms of being able to think about specific mitigations to the economics of no deal, certainly, but more broadly than that, it gets in the way of cooperation over foreign policy, over security, over crime, over terrorism, because if both sides are engaged in finger pointing and mutual recrimination, collaboration across the board is going to suffer. And it strikes me that that is not an outcome that we should want.
Josh, you wanted to come in, and then I'm going to come to some specific questions.
I mean, it does feel slightly like Groundhog Day, doesn't it? It's sort of, you can see the questions got us all sort of energized and back into that territory. I think the other thing I would say is what we can do at the CBI is actually just talking to businesses and finding out the reality of what it means. And I speak to so many businesses at the moment that are saying, look, because of coronavirus, we are having globally to look at our workforce and to reduce our workforce. And we're having to take decisions about where we're going to do that. And if the UK is heading for no deal, and if the negotiations don't move forward, actually that moves the UK up the list in terms of where I'm going to make reductions. So there's, to Nicole's point, that the most important impact of the recession that coronavirus is driving is jobs. We cannot afford that to double down on that with a no-deal Brexit. So I think it is on the ground right now really, really important. It's not a sort of theoretical what might happen in 6 months discussion.
So I'm if I might, going to try and go through some of the questions that are coming in and the points that are coming in. I'm going to put a few to you first, if I might, Nicole. One is, what's your read on the relationship between the UK-EU negotiations and the UK-USA discussions and the timing on that? But a second one, I'm just going to do 3 if I may. The second one is, given what Anand is saying and listening to you, the risks of a deal not being completed, when does the Treasury, when does government reopen Operation Yellowhammer and start no deal planning? Is that happening? And if so, how do people feed into it? And just to be clear, what, Nicole, is your understanding of where things have got to on the idea of regulatory cooperation? Is that an idea that's long since forgotten, or is it still in the mix?
Some great questions there. Yes. So on the UK, EU, UK, US, that was too many acronyms, I couldn't cope, deals. I think the UK government has worked quite hard to make sure that the conflicts between those deals are as reduced as far as possible. Now, that's not to say that, for example, the US, the anathema around food standards, for example, and what the US, it's not to say that the US isn't going to push stuff that would come in conflict with the EU deal, but the UK has tried to keep that off the table in terms of its asks as far as possible. And I think that's probably an underappreciated point, and it is really important. They have, the civil service know that negotiating these 2 huge deals in parallel with our single biggest market and our single biggest country market are both incredibly difficult, both tough negotiators, and they have tried to kind of be very aware of keeping those negotiations separate without having crossover. I think it's still to be seen how far that will play out. I think when you get to those real crunch moments around decisions around technicalities, particularly on the US side, let's see where that goes. But obviously, again, I think coronavirus has changed some of the timetable around the US deal. It is now looking much more like a sort of post-election decision, I think. And again, that kind of changes your timelines and your trade-offs a little bit. Operation Yellowhammer is a really interesting question, and when does the UK government start preparing for no deal again? I mean, we know that just like business, the government is pretty focused on coronavirus. We know that even civil servants within some of those negotiating task force for the Brexit deal got pulled over to go and work on coronavirus. So actually, and they are slowly returning now, but that is a resource point. It's much more difficult if you don't have that flex of thousands of civil servants to reallocate around. So it's tough practically to do. From a business perspective, I think the most important thing isn't where you put the civil servants and where you put the resource, but actually what you do with your regulation. Last time round, when we were facing no deal towards the end of last year, there were a number of sort of technical notices, both on the UK and the EU side, where they were creating sort of exceptions and easements to allow goods to move more smoothly, to allow services to kind of be copied over and allowed to keep continuing. Now, at the start of this year, the Michael Gove's basically said, we're removing those now, we don't want them. Whether that was a negotiating tactic or whatever, doesn't really matter, but for business, it matters, because you're now saying, okay, so it will be no deal from day one in its full force. I think business would want to see, if we do head towards no deal at the end of this year, one of the, and there is no extension or implementation period or anything like that, then those easements coming back in will be essential for, you know, we've just had a food supply chain that's actually managed to cope quite well. Let's not then, you know, hit it while it's down and actually create a whole problem for it. So that will be really important. And on your third question around regulatory cooperation, so look, we're certainly not heading for the kind of sort of deep regulatory alignment, particularly around goods, that I think was hoped for or could have been achieved perhaps. You are now looking at a lighter touch deal, but actually the UK has been quite ambitious around things like it's seeking some regulatory alignment around cars, for example. It's got a number of annexes where it's looking for standards to be deemed as equivalent. The EU right now, though, is saying that it does not want to incorporate those annexes within the deal. So you do have a UK pushing some elements of alignment, but actually they're not under discussion right now.
Okay, Nicole, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but there were just a couple of points I wanted to put to Sean. Sean, if I can, there are two specifics as well. One is I just want to read to you, partly just because it gives me a headache reading it. This is from someone who works in a cargo airline who says this: we're hearing nothing from the UK government on EU negotiations or even their ambitions for aviation. As a cargo airline that needs traffic rights in Europe, we face a cliff edge. On January the 1st, we will either be able to fly within and between the EU 27 or we won't. There is no mitigation possible. We'll be able to serve customers or we won't. There's no possible preparation for this. If we are able to fly, will our staff need work permits? Nobody knows. The situation is a farce. And there's a question in a similar vein about expectations on passporting and financial services and relocation. I was just interested to know, Sean, from your perspective in Brussels on those two big areas, aviation and financial services, whether or not the EU has a sense of what's going to happen in the event that there's not a deal made.
On the aviation point, I think up until the third round, there was quite positive negotiations on aviation, but they have stalled or perhaps rolled back in last week's round. On aviation, there are two sticking points. First one is around ownership. The EU is very, very insistent that on the issue of ownership, it is UK ownership and it isn't, I suppose, exported to a third country. And on the second kind of sticking point is around what they call the fifth freedom, which is around intra-EU flights. At the moment, what has been proposed from the EU side is that a British carrier could fly from London to Madrid, but it couldn't then do Madrid to Lisbon. So those are the two issues. And again, what unfortunately has happened while there had been steps forward and quite positive negotiations in aviation, the insistence from an EU side on level playing field and for the UK to move has frozen all those positive negotiations. On passporting and financial services, it is very clear that the UK will not have passporting on financial services. This is not something that the UK is offering and not something that the EU will offer back. And it is very much around the area of equivalence, and as Nicole said, there was to be agreement or certainly progress by June on equivalence in financial services. Unfortunately, again, last week, because everything was seen through the context of level playing field, there was no movement. And again, until that breaking the kind of mantra around level playing field, all these technical negotiations is quite difficult. The final point is around the level playing field, and everyone's become an expert in it. It means different things to different people. And actually, when you look at the negotiations and what's happening at technical level, there is a lot of commonality in both approach and an agreement on where they want to end up. It has become a political hot potato. But actually, when you look at technical level, there is a lot of level playing field and a lot of equivalence that has been discussed and negotiated. But they cannot, and one of the insistence from the EU side is everything moves along in parallel until we get movement on the political issues, fisheries and level playing field at that high level, nothing can move forward in the technical aspects. But there is positive elements in the negotiations and things are moving forward, but we're stuck because of lack of political leadership.
Sean, thank you. And can I just finish up with you? I mean, let's not. Can you hear me?
Just
a few words.
Not much room for great optimism. Can you not hear me?
No,
we heard
not.
Can
I heard
you hear me,
optimism, which I thought was a good start, but
oh, sorry. Anand, what's your advice to business?
oh god, I didn't hear any of
I got
that.
advice to business.
Okay.
What's
So
advice to
I'll
business?
try.
I was hoping you hadn't said that.
For final thoughts for you, not much great cause for optimism here. We heard that, but what do you think we need to bear in mind? What do you think we're facing over the next few months?
Well, over the next few months and years, I think there are several things. I think in the first place, it would be wise to start preparing for no deal, just as a precaution, because it is a perfectly plausible outcome. More broadly, one of the things that strikes me is just the lack of good interaction between business and government, the way that this government doesn't systematically take the views of business into account in the way that it should. I mean, it's curious at the moment, our politics. On the far left, you have people that just accuse business of wanting to sack people. And in the Tory party, you have people accusing business of just being sort of small c conservative status quo who don't understand the opportunities that Brexit will provide them with. And I think, what I'd like to see during the course of this parliament is some fence mending on both sides of the business government divide, because that relationship needs to function well for our country to function well and for jobs to be created and for our economy to do well. And it's just one of the ways in which the absolute dominance of politics over everything else at the moment has become slightly dysfunctional.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I don't know whether we've got you back properly online. We can see you. No, we can't. So
Can you hear me?
It falls to me to say, Anand, thank you. Nicole, Sean, as ever, thank you. Absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry we had to talk about Brexit again, but we do, and we'll be gathering insight from you to move forward. In the meantime, please come back tomorrow, more about Build Back Better. And please, use social media, talk about the webinars to make sure as many people know about them as possible. And I hope that we have a better host back and functioning for the full time tomorrow, and you won't have to put up with the CBI hosting. Thanks very much indeed, everybody.
Thank you.